Hello and welcome to Foreign Policy Focus, episode 22. I am the host Kyle, and today's show I'm going to touch on a bunch of foreign policy current events news stories and then hop into some analysis on Blowback that I like to share with everyone. As always, if you like the show, consider giving me a rating and review on iTunes. That will help the show to grow. While you're there, go ahead and subscribe to the show. That way you make sure you never miss an episode. I am going to try to get back to doing the episodes so that they release early in the morning rather than in the afternoon. But for now, count on a show sometime Monday, Wednesday, Friday, hopefully before like 5 o'clock Eastern time, but around that time would be the latest they'd be coming out. So I hope everybody enjoys it, and we'll get into today's news. So we're going to start with an interview that I actually heard live, or not live, but on the Scott Horton show. I think Scott Horton got a pretty good scoop on this story. What he did is he had on Orlando Claudio, I believe is how you say his name. I'll make sure to link to the interview so everybody could listen to it. Anyways, what this man told Scott Horton is that he had served in the military, and one of his roles was to go around to the different places and make sure that people were being treated in a manner that wouldn't help to grow a counterinsurgency. This man didn't seem like any sort of anti-war activist, and from the interview, the impression I got is that he just wanted the counterinsurgency to work, and he believed that the way to get the counterinsurgency to work was to treat the population well enough so that they wouldn't want to everybody pick up arms and take them up against America. His idea was that if you treat people a certain way, you could then wage a counterinsurgency. However, if you treat people really poorly, there's going to be a pretty strong counterinsurgency. He gave credentials saying that he had been in previous conflicts, maybe going all the way back to Panama, but definitely some South American ones. He talked about, I believe, maybe Ecuador and Colombia and countries like that. Anyways, I'll be sure, like I said, to link to the interview. Go ahead and check it out if you're interested. Anyways, what this man says that in his role, investigating to make sure people's were keeping up to date on human rights, he visited a camp in Tel Afar, Iraq in 2005 that was run by our current National Security Advisor, H.R. McMaster. At the camp, he witnessed some pretty disturbing things, way too much overcrowding in the prisoner areas, way too many prisoners to be at the camp. What McMaster was doing is that he wasn't letting people go until they gave him information, whether they had it or not. So I'm sure there's a ton of innocent people in the camps that were held there for, I really would have no idea how long, and they were international law says that you're supposed to release people in 14 days, that they can't give you any reason to essentially charge them or to believe that they're enemy combatants. But McMaster didn't care. He just held people until they gave him something. He wasn't feeding the prisoners properly. He wasn't giving them proper medical care, and so this investigator Orlando witnessed all this and filed a report. And while he wasn't the person that would press charges, he certainly, believed that the actions that McMaster took were abuses of either, the abuses of the Geneva Convention, essentially, is what he was saying. I guess, he had wanted and had been ordered to arrest McMaster if this was the kind of, if this was the condition of the camp. However, I guess McMaster left while he was treating and helping out the prisoners, and McMaster was never punished for this. He did seem to indicate that McMaster was never promoted to brigadier general until after this man retired from the military, so he thought that was kind of an interesting coincidence. And in fact, after McMaster, it was announced that McMaster would be brigadier general, then it kind of got put on pause because this man brought up the fact that he had written this report and that McMaster was guilty of war crimes. So I think if you're Trump, one of the questions you would have to ask yourself is this a man I want to be around? Is somebody who committed war crimes and proved himself to be somebody who doesn't care about civilians and will imprison people until they give him the information that he wants, and will essentially treat them like dogs when they're in prison? And so that's a question Trump should be asking himself. Also, there may be a question here for Trump to think of who owns this man. McMaster is obviously somebody with a very dark and very very blackmailable past, we could phrase it that way. I could certainly see that if somebody knew this information, they could really hold it over his head and say, hey, either, you do what we say, or we're going to leak this information or pursue these charges from 2005 when you are kind of found to be a war criminal. So this is definitely something that we should all take note of. Awesome job, Scott Horton, for getting this interview and putting this out there. It's a huge interview for him. I'll make sure to link to it. Everybody should listen to it because we should know what our national security advisor has in his background, and this is a pretty ugly piece of his background. The former test and evaluator for the director of test and evaluation for the military released his report on the F-35. The report basically gives the F-35 a failing grade. It failed in dozens of categories, including some that are really important. So it's not like appearance or, pilot comfort was where the failures were. The failures were in things like weapons and flight capability. So this is definitely just another example of how stupid the F-35 project is, how it's essentially just a wealth transferred from the middle class in America to the very wealthy weapons builders in America. The F-35 has been like a 20-year project. In fact, at one point, they had installed new computers in the planes, but the cameras were so old they wouldn't hook up to the computers anymore, so they had to install new cameras. And I think that's just a really good example of how messed up the whole project is and how big of a failure it really has been and how big of a waste of money it's been. And this man coming out with this report, I think, is one of the first legitimate reports kind of saying, hey, I reviewed what we have in the F-35 since it's been completed and it's a total turd. I know a lot of other websites like War is Boring have really done a good job of documenting the F-35 project along the way and saying, oh, this doesn't work and that doesn't work. But this is a man who is really skilled in evaluating aircraft and was his former career, and he says it's a piece of junk. I think this is one case where the media really got out ahead of this narrative, and they basically, have just labeled the F-35 God's gift to protect America and have really tried to make a big deal out of it. And if you hear anybody talking about the F-35, they're like, oh, America's new super cool stealth bomber can do anything. And I mean, one of the problems with it was really built to do everything. It was built to replace the A-10 Warthog and the F-16, and unfortunately, it isn't as good as either in doing what their main jobs are. And so I think that's a huge problem for the F-35 is that it really isn't possible to do what they wanted to do on this plane. Essentially, they want to get a lot of money from the American people, and so they say, hey, we got this super cool plane that's going to do everything. And Congress, rather than realized they were being sold a false bill of goods, said, oh, man, that's the coolest thing I've ever seen, and you say you're going to build these planes in my state so I could tell my constituents that I voted for something and created a whole bunch of jobs in my district. Now vote for me again. And so it really just works out well for all the people who aren't paying for this plane, but for everybody is paying for it, and everybody who's going to rely on this plane to defend them is going to find that the plane really, really sucks. Yeah, just another story on how our government doesn't work. The Pentagon will no longer be giving us troop deployment numbers from Iraq and Syria. It seems pretty clear that the U.S. well violated their troop caps. I believe in Iraq that troop cap was like 5,200, and in Syria it might have been around 500. Although I thought in 2011 or 2013, either way, the issue had really come up in Congress over war with Syria, and Obama was looking for congressional authorization at AUMF for Syria, and he never got one. And so there's no authorization to attack ISIS in Syria or attack anyone else for that matter. And the U.S. is doing it anyways and without any congressional authority. And so I think the 500 and 5,000 troop caps in Iraq and Syria are complete bogus, and that the U.S. president shouldn't be able to deploy troops in countries where he doesn't have authorization from Congress to do so. Really, I mean, constitutionally, it should require a declaration of war, but we're never going to get that from Congress because they're way too cowardly to ever vote to go to war. They need to be able to say, well, I really didn't support it, and you don't have a vote to prove I did it. From now on, they're not going to be telling us how many troops are in these countries. I think part of the reason has to be that they're well over the caps already of number of American troops who should be in Iraq and Syria both. In Iraq, I know the estimate is around 6,000. I'm actually working on this really cool project, and we were looking last night for an actual troop count on the number of troops in Iraq, and it seems that 6,000 is the best estimate, but you don't really know if that's the actual answer. Also, I really need to look into how many contractors are in Iraq. That would be an interesting question. It could be that we have 6,000 troops and then 20,000 American armed contractors in the country as well. But, that's just another piece of the puzzle, is that to get around having U.S. troops and having Congress have to approve U.S. troops to be in certain countries, the president has now just started hiring contractors, and so we'll put 10,000 armed mercenaries in their country and say, hey, we're not in war here. So that would be the same question. And in Syria, we're, I think, close to 1,000. And so in both cases, we're well over the troop cap. In Syria, we probably doubled it already. And the Pentagon's not going to be telling us how many more troops they're adding, when they're adding more troops. It'll be interesting to see if anybody could really try to keep a figure on how many troops are in these countries. Trump could get up to 10,000 troops in at least Iraq before it may be a serious scandal. And I'm sure he could get a couple thousand troops into Syria. And we have to remember, too, that in Syria, the U.S. troops aren't invited. In Iraq, they're at least wanted there by the Iraqi government, but the Syrian government doesn't want them there. And so if we have Syria, let's say, bomb the U.S. troops in their country, what's the U.S. position? Are we going to go to war with the Syrian government and then allow ISIS or Al-Qaeda to take over Damascus and rule Syria? And it seems like a really messy and not very well thought out situation we've gotten ourselves in Syria. If you really want to think about the Syrian conflict, in that we're putting more U.S. troops in to take Raqqa from Mosul, a group that's going to be invaded by Russia and Assad anyways, and you had to ask yourself, why? Did Congress ever authorize the U.S. to break off, what would that be, eastern Syria from the country? Are we going to try to help the Kurds form a state in Syria? Are we going to try to just rule eastern Syria for ourselves and hope the Kurds do a good enough job patrolling the streets for us? I mean, what's the plan here? And if you're going to put 2,000 troops in a country you're not invaded, doesn't that require some kind of congressional authorization or anything? But man, I can't get over the Syria situation. Sorry, I got a little off track there, though. So anyways, you're not going to get any more troop counts from the Pentagon, so I would say Jason Ditz on antiwar.com is probably the best place to try to keep up with that. Speaking of Syria, we do have civilians starting to flee Raqqa. Part of the reason the civilians are fleeing is because there's a dam upriver on the Euphrates, and there's some fear now that that dam might break. I think a lot of this is probably ISIS propaganda. But really, who knows? The U.S. says the dam's in good condition. The ISIS guys say it isn't. Both of those stories fit the narrative of either side, so you can't count on either, to be honest. But either way, civilians are starting to flee Raqqa for that reason. They're also getting, I guess, kind of pretty anxious about the upcoming invasion by the U.S. government and the Kurds. I'm sure they hear what's going on in Mosul and how civilians are dying by the thousands in that city, and so they're probably thinking, oh, well, I might want to risk it with ISIS at this point and hope they don't shoot me running away, rather than stay here and possibly get bombed by the U.S. Moving around the Middle East to Afghanistan, we have the U.S. killing 9 civilians in Afghanistan. Somehow, this seems to be a really strange story, and there is an investigation into this, so I'll be interested in what the outcome is. But the U.S. Troops deployed to destroy a Taliban weapons cache, and in the process of destroying that weapons cache, somehow 9 civilians got killed who were near it. So it must have been a situation where the weapons cache was still in Taliban-held territory, and they maybe used some type of missile-propelled grenade or airstrike or artillery strike to blow up that weapons cache, and it turns out maybe there was bigger weapons in there than they thought, or there were civilians closer to it than they thought. I mean, who knows, but another tragedy for the U.S. in foreign countries. This is just, again, the U.S. killing more civilians over there, and these stories, all that the stories are, really going to make out is to be the U.S. kills more civilians overseas. Last news story I'm going to talk about today is that Trump is trying to pressure China to make a deal with North Korea. I believe the U.S. is kind of looking for, at this point, North Korea to pretty much unconditionally give up their nuclear weapons program. I doubt that they would let North Korea keep the nuclear weapons that they have, or at least this would be the, American proposition. Maybe they would be able to keep one. Who knows? They certainly would have to give up the ability to make any more in the future, and they would probably have to give up on their ballistic missile weapons program as well. So it seems like from this starting point for the United States, I doubt North Korea is going to find anything acceptable in those conditions. But optimistic, maybe they will. I would love for Kim Jong-un not to have any more nukes, just because, man, he's a terrible dude. Although if he does give up all of his nukes, the U.S. will probably invade and have a proxy war with Russia and China there too. So maybe it's better that crazy little guy's in charge with a couple nukes. But what I'm at, so Trump is expecting China to solve this problem. How China's going to do that, I don't know, because like I said, from the conditions that America's asking for, they seem way beyond anything North Korea would be willing to accept. To kind of turn this into a threat, Trump did say that, all possibilities will be on the table if China doesn't move forward with this. So it seems to me that Trump is at least saying that, hey, China, you either make a deal with North Korea, or there's a possibility that we're going to conduct a first strike against North Korea. So that's definitely going to be a story. That's definitely going to be a story that we need to follow going forward. But I think the most important part of this story really is the fact of how insane the Trump administration is on foreign policy. They're asking for an unthinkable deal from the North Korean perspective, and they're demanding that it happens or we're going to bomb them. And so I think this brings us to the common theme in today's episode that I want to talk about, and that is blowback. And if we look at what's happening in North Korea, I think we could see that a lot of the North Korean actions are kind of blowback to the U.S. action. So the U.S. conducts these major operations in the sea next to Korea with Japan and South Korea that simulate an invasion of North Korea. And so right on the doorstep of North Korea, the U.S. is practicing invading North Korea. Now, in response to that, Kim Jong-un decides that he's going to launch some ballistic missiles into the sea towards Japan to say, hey, if you guys this makes me unhappy, right? He doesn't want to look weak. Kim Jong-un's an idiot strongman dictator as well. It's not like he's a better person than Trump and I would, prefer to live in North Korea under Kim Jong-un. I just prefer our country not to go to war with Kim Jong-un in the first place. And so this has kind of been the pattern in North Korea, is where the U.S. will put sanctions on North Korea, or the U.S. will declare that North Korea is in the axis of evil, or they will declare that North Korea is kind of an enemy state, and then that pushes North Korea into taking these, drastic actions to show that they can't be pushed around or messed with on the international stage. I think that one of the most intelligent things that North Korea has ever expressed is that they, one of the reasons that they have the nuclear weapons program and they think it's so important is because they look at what happened to Gaddafi and Saddam Hussein, where the U.S. in those cases decided to take out what we have in those countries is a dictator that decided to give up his nuclear weapons and then got invaded by the United States. And so that is essentially just blowback from our wars in Libya and Iraq, is that now that since we went to war in Libya and Iraq and killed Gaddafi and Saddam, now Kim Jong-un is saying, well, nukes are going to keep me safe. It's not having nukes that will allow you to invade. I think there's a lot to kind of that thinking in security for North Korea that nuclear states don't get invaded. Now to talk about blowback on a more general level. So blowback is the idea that terrorist attacks occur because of oppressions of populations by bigger countries. And so whenever the United States essentially has formed an empire at this point, we have troops stationed all over the world. We kept troops stationed in the Middle East and Saudi Arabia. We continue to help the Israeli oppression of the Palestinians, and that led to situations where we had attacks across the Middle East, and eventually leading up to the 9/11 terror attacks, where as a response to U.S. interventionism overseas, Saddam Hussein or Osama bin Laden was able to radicalize enough Muslim people to fly planes into buildings in the United States. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that this is justified. I don't think that terrorism is ever the more appropriate moral position. I don't think it's ever the better practical position. I don't agree with it at all. They shouldn't have done it, and those people are obviously evil for killing 3,000 American citizens. However, when you look at it from the other side, you just have to realize that America starved 500,000 Iraqis during the Clinton administration with the sanctions that were put on the country after the first Bush went to war there and destroyed a lot of civilian infrastructure. And so we must realize that those actions, whenever you're willing to starve 500,000 children to death, then part of that action, part of the consequences of those actions are you're going to piss off some really crazy people, and some of those really crazy people may do some really bad things. And so this is part of the, equation when Americans need to be thinking about, do we want to go to war here? Do we want to have these actions here? We need to realize that wars kill civilians, sanctions kill civilians, occupations are absolutely brutal on the civilian population of that country. And if those are the actions that this country is going to pursue, where we're going to occupy, invade, and murder civilians, then eventually we're going to piss off some bad people, and those bad people are going to do something bad to Americans too. And this just needs to be a part of the equation. It needs to be talked about, but it never is. And in fact, you're called anti-American for even suggesting that the people who do bad things to Americans may be able to justify those actions to themselves by the atrocities that America commits overseas as well. Obviously, in both situations, it's the civilian populations that lose. The jihadists, they're getting their way. They're certainly growing and expanding and becoming bigger and more well-funded. And I'm sure the people at the top of these organizations are probably living pretty decent lives, especially compared to the lives of the civilians in these countries. And the same thing on the U.S. side. The politicians get rich, they get bigger, they get better, they get more powerful, but the American people don't ever increase in standard of living. And so while Americans may think we're just going to war with the jihadists, we're going to war with the jihadists plus the civilians that live around them and who may die from our bombs and killings, and this is just going to make this situation worse again. I mean, that's the overall point that I want to get across here, is that just from a practical point for American citizens, it's not a good thing for us to go to these terrorist wars, because eventually it's going to create more terrorists. 9/11 didn't happen in a vacuum. It didn't happen one day because some people read the Quran the wrong way and got really crazy and just wanted to do something really crazy and stupid. 9/11 happened because Americans starved 500,000 Iraqi civilians to death, or children to death. And so this is blowback. This is what it is. And this is what we need to start factoring into our foreign policy discussions. And we can't just ignore it anymore. I think for too long our media has really ignored this point. It has really just tried to kind of denounce anybody who makes it as un-American. But it is American, and it is a practical point to make. Whenever you're kind of making those decisions, do we want to go to war? You need to understand that one of the possible outcomes of do you want to go to war is, do you want a war against your civilian population as well? I mean, even looking back to World War II, Japan put a whole bunch of balloons with bombs in them in the jet stream, and one of them ended up in Oregon and blew up, I think, some school children. I don't think any of them died, but I think they were just injured. But no matter what your war is, eventually your civilian population is going to be targeted and attacked if you support that war. And this is becoming ever more true as we get into a future where international travel is more easy and possible. I mean, I suppose there was a time where if you're England, you could, go to war with people on the other side of the world, because none of those people are ever going to be able to get back to England. I mean, they're just, it was impossible to travel that far. And if you did, 75% chance that you died along the way. Nowadays, you can hop on a plane from Iraq to, New York City 3 times a week at least. And so these are things we need to remember. This is why terrorism is so dangerous, and we need to realize that if we want to go to war, this needs to be in the calculation. All right, that's where I'm going to wrap up the show today, everybody. If you like the show, check out the Facebook group Foreign Policy Focus. Give me a rating and a review on iTunes. Check out my website, kylesfilesblog.com. Files is spelled F-Y-L-E-S. Share the show with your friends and family. Get it out there. Get it to more listeners. That way we could change the conversation on foreign policy, and I will talk to you all on Wednesday.